4:12, winter of 1975. The radiator in the corner of the room didn't just hiss, it wheezed, a rhythmic metallic gasp that seemed to struggle against the biting frost pressing hard against the window panes. Outside, the world was a blur of gray slush and skeletal trees. But inside room 412, the air was thick with something heavier than the smell of antiseptic and floor wax. It smelled of old brass, machine oil, and the sour, sharp scent of a life reaching its final, frantic gears. He was a man of small stature, but in that hospital bed, he looked almost skeletal, a collection of fragile bones wrapped in skin that reminded me of the yellowed vellum I used for my Sunday ledgers. His long, slender fingers, once capable of manipulating the smallest springs in the world, were now twitching against the white sheets. They moved in a phantom rhythm, as if he were still winding a ghost watch that only he could see. I sat in the hard wooden chair beside him, the same chair where I had watched 100 men find their peace or their terror. My own hands felt heavy in my lap. I remember the scratch of my woolen cardigan against my neck, a constant, itchy reminder that I was still among the living, while the man before me was already half shadow. He didn't look at me at first. His eyes, dark and clouded by the cataracts of 82 years, were fixed on the bedside table. There, resting on a lace doily that looked absurdly delicate for such a place, sat a dozen watches, pocket watches, wrist watches, even a small ornate traveling clock with a cracked glass face, and they were all ticking. The sound was staggering. It wasn't a unified pulse. It was a chaotic, overlapping cacophony of metallic heartbeats. Click-clack, tin-tin-tin, a frantic race of 1,000 tiny hammers hitting 1,000 tiny anvils. It felt as though the room itself were a giant machine, vibrating with the collective anxiety of time running out. I felt a cold sweat prickle at the base of my spine. I have seen death in many forms, but I have never seen it so loud. He finally spoke, and his voice sounded like dry leaves being crushed under a heavy boot. He told me his name mattered less than his trade. He had been the town's silent observer for 50 years, the man who kept the mayor's time, the man who ensured the banker's appointments were never missed, the man who kept the gears of the city turning. But as he gripped my wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a dying man, I saw the terror in his gaze. He leaned in, the scent of stale peppermint and illness washing over me. He whispered that every clock he ever touched for the powerful men of this town held more than just a mainspring. He described the minute modifications, the tiny, vibrating copper diaphragms he had hidden behind the Roman numerals. He had turned the town's mantelpieces into ears. He had spent decades listening to the sins whispered in study rooms and the conspiracies hatched over mahogany desks. I felt a sickening hollow open up in my chest. I looked at those watches on the table, their ticking now sounding like 1,000,000 tiny voices trying to scream at once. I wondered how many of my own secrets had been captured by the rhythmic swing of a pendulum I had once admired in the parish hall. I looked at his hands, those artisan fingers that had betrayed the very concept of a home's sanctity. He reached for a specific piece, a gold stopwatch from 1920 with a broken wax seal on the back. His breath hitched, a jagged sound that broke the rhythm of the ticking. He told me he couldn't take the key to the grave. He spoke of a vault, a cold place beneath the floorboards of his shop where the wax cylinders lived, the recorded history of a town built on lies. He was holding the key, a small iron thing, so tightly that it was beginning to bruise his palm. I wanted to pull away. I wanted to tell him that I was a man of God, not a vault for his stolen secrets. But I stayed. I stayed because I saw the way his eyes darted to the shadows in the corner of the room, as if the ghosts of the men he had spied on were already waiting to collect their debt. I felt a profound, crushing weight of my own inadequacy. How do you absolve a man who didn't just break a commandment, but turn the very passage of time into a weapon. I still feel the phantom vibration of those watches in my own pulse sometimes. It makes me wonder if anything we say is truly lost to the wind, or if the very walls around us are simply waiting for the right craftsman to give them a voice. If all your private words were recorded by the objects you trusted most, would you still recognize the person you claim to be? 122. North Main Street. Midnight, 3 days later. The iron key felt like a shard of ice pressing against my thigh through the fabric of my trousers. I stood before the narrow, soot-stained storefront of the watchmaker's shop, the wind whipping my charcoal cardigan against my ribs. The street was deserted, illuminated only by the sickly orange hum of a single flickering street lamp. This part of town had a way of feeling forgotten even in broad daylight, but at midnight, it felt like a tomb. I checked the street one last time, my breath blooming in white, ragged clouds before me. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in my chest, drumming a rhythm that the old man in room 412 would have recognized. I slid the key into the lock. It didn't turn easily. It resisted, a stubborn, grinding protest of metal on metal that echoed far too loudly in the hollow silence of the street. Then, with a sharp skeletal snap, the bolt gave way. The smell hit me the moment I crossed the threshold. It wasn't just the oil and brass I had expected. It was the scent of stagnant time. Dust, heavy and gray, coated every surface like a shroud. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting a violent path through the darkness. The walls were lined with clocks, hundreds of them, tall, narrow grandfather clocks that stood like sentinels in the shadows, small, round kitchen clocks, elegant French carriage clocks, but they were all silent. The ticking had stopped when the master's heart did, leaving a silence so absolute it made my ears ring with a high-pitched, lonely whine. I moved deeper into the shop, the floorboards letting out a sharp, piercing shriek under my boots. It sounded like a wounded animal, a warning that I was trespassing in a place where secrets were meant to sleep. My light danced over the watchmaker's workbench. It was a chaotic altar of precision. Tiny screwdrivers, no larger than needles, lay scattered next to springs that looked like silver hairs. A magnifying loop sat near a half-disassembled pocket watch, its gears spilled out like the entrails of a mechanical bird. I remembered the old man's long artisan fingers, and I felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief. He had spent his life surrounded by beauty, by the intricate dance of physics and art, only to use it as a veil for something so sordid. I looked at my own hands in the flashlight's glow, the liver spots, the fine tremors of a man who has seen too many winters. I wondered if I was any better, keeping the secrets of the confessional while he kept the secrets of the stopwatch. I found the spot he had described near the back of the workshop, hidden beneath a heavy, oil-stained rug. I kicked the rug aside, the movement kicking up a cloud of dust that made me cough, a dry, hacking sound that seemed to be swallowed instantly by the thousands of silent faces on the walls. I knelt, my knees cracking with a sound like dry twigs. The floorboards here were different. They were slightly raised, the wood darker, polished by the friction of frequent use. I used a flat-headed chisel I found on the bench to pry the boards up. The wood groaned, a slow, deep protest that vibrated through my arms. Beneath the floor sat a small steel safe, its surface dull and cold. I used the second smaller key the watchmaker had given me. The door swung open with a heavy, oiled grace. Inside were the wax cylinders, hundreds of them, stacked in neat numbered rows within felt-lined boxes. These were the memories he had spoken of, the stolen breaths of a town that thought it was alone. My hand trembled as I reached for one. It was cool to the touch, the surface smooth and dark. I saw a label on one of the boxes, a date from 1955, a name I recognized, the former chief of police. I found a playback machine on a small shelf inside the vault. a hand-cranked device with a large, flared horn. I hesitated. Every fiber of my being told me to lock the safe and burn the shop to the ground. As a chaplain, I am a vessel for burdens, but this was a library of betrayals. Yet the curiosity was a physical weight, a pressure behind my eyes. I placed a cylinder on the mandrel and began to turn the crank. The sound that emerged from the horn wasn't clear. It was a sea of static at first, a rhythmic scratching like a fingernail on a chalkboard. Then, out of the noise, a voice crystallized. It was a woman's voice, brittle and desperate. I recognized the cadence immediately. It was Martha, the woman who had played the organ in our church for 40 years until she passed away in '68. She wasn't praying. She was pleading with someone, her voice hushed but raw with a terror I had never heard in the pews. She was speaking about a fire at the mill that everyone had called an accident. She was naming names, the families who sat in the front row every Sunday, the men who shook my hand and donated to the roof fund. I felt the air leave my lungs. The static returned, a rushing sound like a distant waterfall, drowning out her confession. I slumped back against the workbench, the cold of the shop seeping through my cardigan and into my very marrow. I felt dirty, an accomplice after the fact. I looked at the silent clocks surrounding me and realized they weren't just machines. They were witnesses. I thought of all the times I had sat in those very homes, sipping tea and offering platitudes, while the clock on the mantel sat there, its copper diaphragm vibrating with every lie told in my presence. The watchmaker hadn't just left me a key, he had left me a curse. He wanted me to know that the world I served was a hollow shell, held together by the very gears he had polished. I stayed there in the dark for a long time, the only sound the ragged, uneven rhythm of my own breathing. I realized then that truth is not a light that sets you free. Sometimes it's a weight that pins you to the floor, leaving you to wonder if the lies were the only thing keeping the ceiling from collapsing. If you knew that every kind word ever spoken to you was shadowed by a hidden truth, would you still have the courage to listen? The Watchmaker's Workshop, dawn of the fourth day. The first light of morning didn't bring hope. It was a pale, sickly gray that bled through the grime of the shop windows, illuminating the dancing dust motes that had settled on my charcoal cardigan like a shroud of ashes. My eyes felt like they had been rubbed with sand, a stinging, gritty reminder that I had spent the entire night in that subterranean vault, listening to the ghosts of a town I thought I knew. I sat on the cold floor, my back against the steel safe, cradling the last wax cylinder in my trembling, liver-spotted hands. It was a small, unassuming thing, no different from the others, yet it felt heavier than a lead casket. On its side, etched in the watchmaker's precise, spindly script, was a date from 10 years ago, the night my predecessor, Father Miller, had passed away in his sleep. I didn't want to hear it. Every muscle in my 78-year-old body screamed at me to stand up, to lock the vault, and to walk out into the crisp winter air without looking back. But the silence of the shop was pressing in on me, a physical force that demanded an answer. I stood up, my knees letting out a sharp, brittle pop that echoed like a pistol shot in the stillness. I walked to the playback machine, the iron key cold against my palm. I placed the cylinder on the mandrel and began to turn the crank. The sound of the gears was a rhythmic, metallic grind, a slow, tired protest against the work they were being forced to do. Then the static began. It was a low hum at first, like the sound of a distant hive, and then a voice broke through. It wasn't a confession, it was a conversation. I heard the clink of a teacup against a saucer, a sound so domestic and ordinary, it made my stomach churn. Then I heard Father Miller's voice, soft, wheezing, the voice of a man who was already halfway to the grave. He wasn't talking about theology. He was talking about me. He was telling the watchmaker that the young chaplain they were bringing in, the man I used to be, was too soft, too eager to believe in the goodness of the flock. The watchmaker laughed, a dry, rattling sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. He told Miller not to worry, that the clocks were already in place in the new chaplain's office. He said that by the time I realized the walls were listening, I would be so tangled in the town's secrets that I would have no choice but to keep them. I stopped cranking. The voice slowed, deepening into a demonic, distorted groan before vanishing into a hiss of dead air. I felt a coldness wash over me that had nothing to do with the winter wind. My entire life here, my sermons, my counseling, the hands I had held at deathbeds, it was all built on a foundation of calculated betrayal. I looked at the thousands of silent clock faces on the walls. They weren't just witnesses. They were a prison. The watchmaker hadn't just recorded the sins of the town. He had ensured that even the man of God was part of the machinery. I knew what I had to do. I walked to the back of the workshop where a small cast-iron wood stove sat in the corner. My movements were slow, deliberate, the weight of my silver hair feeling like a crown of lead. I opened the stove door. The hinges let out a long, mourning wail. I reached into the safe and grabbed a handful of cylinders. They felt slick, like cold skin. I threw them into the belly of the stove. Then I grabbed the kerosene. The liquid splashed against the wax with a hollow, drumming sound. I struck a match. The flame was a tiny, flickering orange bird in the gloom. I dropped it. The fire didn't just burn, it roared. It was a hungry, violent thing that sent a wave of blistering heat against my face, turning my hazel eyes into twin reflections of the inferno. The smell was horrific. The scent of melting wax and ancient oil, the burning hair of 1,000 dead secrets. I watched as the cylinders melted into a black, bubbling sludge. The voices of the mayors, the bankers, the organists, and my own predecessor were all being reduced to smoke and ash. I felt a strange, hollow lightness in my chest, a sensation that I was finally breathing for the first time in 40 years. But as I stood there, the heat singeing the edges of my cardigan, I realized the truth. You can burn the records, but you cannot unhear the static. The fire died down to a low, pulsing amber glow, leaving the shop in a deeper shadow than before. I walked to the front door, the floorboards groaning under my boots, a final, weary goodbye. I stepped out onto the sidewalk. The sun was finally rising, a sharp white light that made me squint. The town was beginning to wake up. I saw the milkman making his rounds, the baker opening his shop, the familiar faces of a community that believed its secrets were safe. I walked back toward the hospital, my shadow long and thin on the cobblestones. I thought of the watchmaker in room 412, who was likely drawing his final breath at this very moment. He had given me the truth, not as a gift, but as a final act of clockwork precision, the last gear turning to ensure the machine never truly stopped. I still have the iron key. It sits in the pocket of my cardigan, a cold, heavy reminder of the night the clocks went silent. I look at the people I serve now, and I don't see their smiles or their Sunday best. I see the shadows behind their eyes. I see the invisible wires that connect them to the things they've said in the dark. I am the keeper of a library that no longer exists. A man who knows the melody of a town built on a discordance of lies. If you found the key to the vault where all the hidden truths of your world were kept, would you have the strength to burn it? Or would you find yourself turning the crank just to hear the sound of your own name?